I love that video so much. I am so thankful for Kalina, the team of volunteers that she leads at Mariners Huntington Beach, all the volunteers who serve in our food pantry at Mariners Santa Ana and Mariners Irvine. Mariners Online, you're a part of that story. I hope you picked up on that. She first came to our church because someone shared the link with her from our online service. And so I'm so glad you're a part of the Mariners community. I welcome you today, Mariners Online, also those who are watching with a group of people. We call that Mariners Hosted Here. We love that you are doing this together. This goldfish right here is likely not thinking much about the water surrounding him. He's not thinking likely, I am surrounded currently by 2 hydrogen atoms and 1 oxygen atom, and that is making up everything that surrounds me. He's just enjoying his day. At least I hope he's enjoying his day. He's just swimming around in the water, not thinking much about the environment in which he lives. This is just the air that he breathes. In the book, The Air We Breathe, Glenn Scrivener compares us to goldfish, that we live in an environment that we often don't think much of. And in our current cultural context in the West, we value things such as equality, compassion, caring for the poor. And that is just the environment in which we live. And we think it's normal, but the reality is it is not normal when you look at human history. In fact, when you go back to ancient times, even some of the writers that you studied in school that people quote from today, they did not value compassion and equality and caring for the poor. That was not the air they breathed. It wasn't their environment at all. Plato, in his very famous Republic, said that people are born with different types of metal in your soul. And some people are valuable and some people are worthless. That's what Plato wrote and believed. Aristotle, perhaps you've heard of him, in his very famous Politics, he believed that some people were born to be leaders and others were born to be oppressed. They were born to be slaves, he said. And then Cicero, the very famous Roman orator, he said of slaves in Rome that they should just be content to be slaves because that is who they are. That's who they're destined to be. So the culture, the air that people breathed then was very different than the air we breathe now. There wasn't conversations about consent and equality and caring for other people and compassion. It was very much a hierarchical, dominating, hurt people kind of society. What changed? What happened? Christianity is what happened. God the Son, Jesus, who we believe is the King of Kings and Lord of Lords, entered this world and he served us. He rescued us, those of us who believe in him, and brought us into his kingdom. And in his kingdom, he insists that we believe that every single person is created in the image of God. So the early Christians started treating people as if they were created in the image of God. In his book, The Air We Breathe, Scrivener wrote this: the extraordinary impact of Christianity is seen in the fact that you don't notice it. You already hold, and he's writing to those who are Christians and non-Christians, you already hold particularly Christian-ish views, and the fact that you think of these values as natural, obvious, or universal shows how profoundly the Christian revolution has shaped you. He says you're like the goldfish. You don't realize that the Christian revolution has shaped every single one of us. I talk more with Glenn about his writing on this week's If I Had More Time podcast because I want to get into teaching James, but I do invite you to listen to the podcast wherever you listen to podcasts this week. We're going to talk more about how the Christian revolution has shaped us. And it's not only Christians who believe this. So clearly a Christian would say Christianity has changed the world, but it's not only Christians who believe that. In fact, Friedrich Nietzsche, who hated Christianity, he believed that it was Christianity that brought in the new set of values that really turned the world upside down. And he hated that fact. He hated Christianity, Nietzsche did. He called it a slave morality. He did not like at all our belief that God became poor for us. Nietzsche thought, what kind of God would do that? It's ridiculous. What kind of God serves people? What kind of God comes here for people? And he hated that caused us Christians to value the poor and to care for the weak. Nietzsche hated this because he thought it would ruin society, that it's really the strong who must survive and the weak must be eliminated. So Nietzsche couldn't stand the Christian faith, couldn't stand that Christianity brought in these new set of values that we live from and breathe. So this is what we're holding to as Christians, and even non-Christians are observing that this changed the world. We believe that Jesus is king. He entered this world and started a new kingdom that has really changed everything. Though we don't live it perfectly, though our world is not fully valuing equality and compassion and justice, we do have a new set of values in our culture because Jesus is king and he started an everlasting kingdom. And there's some people, perhaps you like the kingdom values. You just don't want Jesus to be your king. You would say, and lots of people have said this, I do value caring for the poor. I do value equality and compassion. I just don't believe all the stuff you Christians believe. I just don't want Jesus to be my king. Essentially, you're saying, I want the kingdom without Jesus ruling and reigning over me. But that's actually a really inconsistent view. At least that's what John Gray, who's a very famous atheist, pointed out in his book, 7 Types of Atheism, which really stirred up some controversy among atheists because he showed there's not all atheists are the same. There's different types of atheism. And he called out the secular humanistic atheist, those atheists who say, I don't believe in God, but I value human rights. I value human dignity. John Gray said, this is inconsistent. He said, those are both imaginary. John Gray is not a Christian. He says God is imaginary, but human rights are imaginary. You can't have human rights if you don't have God. And since God isn't real, you can't have human rights is essentially what he wrote. This is what he said. Like the God of monotheism, humanity is a work of the imagination. So some would say if you want the kingdom without the king, you're being inconsistent. But then there's other people who want the king. I want Jesus. I want Jesus to forgive me. I want Jesus to give me peace and joy. But I don't want the kingdom. I don't want to care for the poor. I don't want to spend my life worrying about having compassion on people. That too is inconsistent. Because if Jesus is really your king, he's going to motivate you to care for the people that he cares about. We are studying the book of James. We get to chapter 2 today. And James, the half-brother of Jesus, is writing from the perspective that Jesus is his king. Even though he was the half-brother of Jesus, he opens his book saying he's the servant of the Lord, of the King Jesus. And he's also writing about how we live in this kingdom, how believing that Jesus is our king and then having values of his kingdom where we live, that's truly consistent faith. And so we get to chapter 2 today, and this is what James, the half-brother of Jesus, writes. My brothers and sisters, do not show favoritism as you hold on to the faith in our glorious Lord Jesus Christ. For if someone comes into your meeting wearing a gold ring and dressed in fine clothes, and a poor person dressed in filthy clothes also comes in, if you look with favor on the one wearing the fine clothes and say, sit here in a good place, and yet you say to the poor person, stand over there or sit there on the floor by my footstool, haven't you made distinctions among yourselves and become judges with evil thoughts? Let's stop here for a moment. Now, I want you to notice that James is writing in these verses about the sin of favoritism, about categorizing people and treating people differently. And the word for favoritism that he uses, the very first verse that we read, is this word. We'll put it on the screen in the original language. I'm not even sure how to say it. The point is not knowing how to say it. The point is that scholars marvel over this word, which we translate in the English Bible, favoritism. And the reason scholars marvel over this word is because they can't find it anywhere else. In no Greek literature, they can't find it anywhere. Essentially, because everybody in the culture treated people with distinction. Everyone in the culture categorized people. It was so normal. The air that people breathed in that day was to actually treat the rich with more honor and to dishonor the poor. James is giving a prohibition. He's saying we don't live that way in the kingdom of Jesus, but this word, the reason scholars are shocked by it is because they realize James is introducing a new ethic, a new way to live. These early Christians who had entered the kingdom of Jesus, they were living a new way, which was to treat every single person as an image bearer of God, to not show favoritism. Luke Ferry, he writes this very popular, it's a best-selling philosophy book called A Brief History of Thought. He's also not a Christian, but he recognizes as he studies how people have thought throughout the centuries that it was indeed Christianity that started people being treated with dignity and care and being treated with equality. This is what he said. It was Christianity that invented the idea that all men are equal in dignity, an idea that does not exist anywhere in Greek or Roman antiquity, and that one would search for in vain in other civilizations. And so what you're reading right now, I want you to see how precious this is, how beautiful this is. You are seeing the source document that changed the world. It was Christians that ushered in a new way of treating people. And the reason they did is they read these words by the half-brother of Jesus who said, we must treat everyone with equality because every single person is created by God. God loves every single person, pursues every single person. Jesus died for every single person. This was revolutionary in that day. Now, James says that when we actually categorize people and we don't treat people with equality, notice what he says in verse 4, you've made distinctions among yourselves. So you're categorizing people and you are a judge with an evil thought. And you and I, we shouldn't be the judge of people because we're not the creator. He is the creator. Every person is created by him. And then therefore, when we dishonor people, we're dishonoring God because God is the one who created people. Now, the early Christians are living this way, but we still struggle today. All of us do. We struggle to not show favoritism. We struggle at times to think of a category of someone better than someone else. All of us have lived in that environment at some point. All of us have sinned. All of us have struggled. I grew up in the South, and oftentimes people in the South, at least it feels this way, were looked down upon because of our accent. You'll see it. You may have looked down on us. You may have turned on the news and seen someone in the South interview with their accent. You may have thought, that person, not very smart right there. That's perhaps what you thought, but it's not true. Don't let the accent fool you. I grew up in the New Orleans area. There's a story told of this high school senior who graduates from a high school in New Orleans, gets into Harvard and goes up to the Northeast, is in the dorm rooms on opening weekend of school. She's at Harvard. And she meets the family of her roommate. And the family of the roommate, the father of the family says, well, welcome to Harvard. It's good to meet you. And she, a Southerner, just says in this really sweet accent, where y'all from? And he, a little frustrated, says, we're from the place where we know not to end a sentence with a preposition. And she says, aha, where are you from, jerk? Just a great story. She was smarter than he realized. It's not only accents that people categorize people. There's lots of reasons. Political affiliation, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, all kinds of reasons that people will say this person is more valuable than someone else, or this person is going to be looked down on. And James is saying we should not do that at all. Every single person is created equal before God. We must not show favoritism. And when we do, we are a judge with an evil thought. And so don't show favoritism, he says. Now, sometimes the rich will show favoritism against the poor. You've heard perhaps rich people say things like this about the poor. Well, the reason they're poor is because they are just lazy, as if there's never any types of systems or cycles of poverty that could cause someone impoverished to be trapped in some cycle. And it's not only the rich who will look down on the poor. Sometimes the poor will look down on the rich and say of the rich, well, that person's rich. He must be greedy. He must be entitled. He's probably a trust fund baby. And so the poor will look down on the rich. But in this passage, what James is speaking to is actually the rich looking down upon the poor. He gives this hypothetical situation about a church gathering, and a poor person comes in and a rich person comes in. And if you treat the rich person better than you treat the poor person, you are a judge with an evil thought. We must not show favoritism. Everybody is equal in the eyes of God, is what he's teaching. And this changed the world. Now, the reason that we are not to show favoritism is further threaded out in the next several verses. Look with me at verse 5. Listen, my dear brothers and sisters, didn't God choose the poor in this world to be rich in faith and heirs of the kingdom that he promised to those who love him? Yet you've dishonored the poor. Don't the rich oppress you and drag you into court? Don't they blaspheme the good name that was invoked over you? Indeed, if you fulfill the royal law prescribed in the scripture, love your neighbor as yourself, you are doing well. If, however, you show favoritism, you commit sin and are convicted by the law as transgressors. Whoever keeps the entire law and yet stumbles at one point is guilty of breaking it all. For he who said, do not commit adultery, also said, do not commit murder. So if you do not commit murder, if you do not commit adultery, but you murder, you are a lawbreaker. This is God's word. So in this passage, the verses we just read, James is saying, here's the reason that favoritism must be rooted out of your life. It breaks God's heart and it breaks God's law. It breaks his heart. For us to show favoritism towards someone based on a categorization that humanity puts on other people, it breaks the heart of God. For us to neglect the poor or to look down on the poor breaks the heart of God. In fact, he says very clearly, didn't God choose the poor in this world to be rich in faith? What God is emphasizing in this passage is that he's always pursued people who know they need him, and it's often the poor who are more likely to realize they need him. Didn't God choose the poor, is what James is writing? Now, this is perhaps different than how you have thought of the word choose. Maybe growing up, like me, you played football in the streets, you played basketball, and there's a bunch of guys in the street, and there's like 10, and the two best players get to be captains, and those captains choose people to be on their team, one after the other. And the first person selected, you never want to be the last, the first person selected is who everyone thinks is going to be the best athlete, then the second, then the third. You want to be picked first. And you're thinking when you're chosen, I'm being chosen because this team needs me. I'm being chosen because of my good deeds. I'm being chosen because of what I can bring to the table, what I can bring to the court, what I can bring to the field. But that is not at all what God does when he chooses us to enter his kingdom and chooses us to be a part of his family. He doesn't look for those of us who are talented, for those of us who have something to give as if he needs something. God does not need anything from us. We need him. He does not need us. What he looks for when he chooses is those who know they need him. The person who is selected by God, the person who is chosen by God to enter into his kingdom is the person who knows I need the grace of Jesus. God loves every single person. He pursues, he wants you, but the person who he selects is the person who knows that he needs the forgiveness and the grace of Jesus. And it's often the poor who realize they need his grace. James is likely thinking of the sermon he heard Jesus, his half-brother, say. Jesus said this in Matthew 5, verse 3, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for the kingdom of heaven is theirs." Jesus did not say, blessed, happy are the middle class in spirit, those who can work really hard to earn my forgiveness. He did not say, blessed are the rich, those who have everything. That's not what he said. Jesus said, blessed are the poor in spirit. That's who enters my kingdom. That's who ends up belonging to me because they know they need me. The only thing you need to receive God's forgiveness and grace is need, but not everybody has it. The poor are more likely to have it, which is why James is speaking with such high value of the poor in this culture, because to violate the poor, to take advantage of the poor, to oppress the poor, it violates the heart of God. It also violates the law of God. In the passage that we just read, James is remembering hearing Jesus talk about the two greatest commandments. Jesus took all of the commandments in the Old Testament and he summed them up. He said one of these commandments is vertical and one of them is horizontal. Vertically, here's the greatest commandment. You're to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind. And horizontally, you're to love your neighbor as yourself. James quotes Jesus here and says, if you show favoritism, if you oppress the poor, you are violating, he calls it the royal law to love your neighbor as yourself. In fact, some of us have thought, man, that's like a small sin. To mistreat someone, to show favoritism, to not value the poor, to categorize people. That's not a big, I know it's wrong, but it's a small sin. It's not like one of the big ones. It's not like murder and adultery. James goes so hardcore right here. He says, if you break one part of the law, it's guilty of breaking all of the law, and showing favoritism in terms of breaking the heart of God and the law of God is the same thing as committing murder or committing adultery. You are still a lawbreaker because you're violating the royal law to love your neighbor as yourself. It is not a minor sin. It is a big deal before our holy God, because murder violates the image of God on someone to take a life. Adultery violates the image of God on someone to step outside of God's design for sex. And favoritism violates the image of God on someone to look down upon someone who carries God's image on their life. So James is elevating high the sin of favoritism, saying this is really a big deal. You're violating the royal law of God. Don't show favoritism. Okay, so how? I don't want to violate God's heart. You don't want to. You don't want to violate his heart. You don't want to violate his law. So what's the solution? Well, James continues in the next two verses. He gives us the way that we will not show favoritism, the way that we'll actually be merciful and kind people. And remember, the early readers, they read this and they changed the world because they actually did what it said. James writes this, verse 12 and 13. Speak and act as those who are to be judged by the law of freedom, for judgment is without mercy to the one who has not shown mercy. Mercy triumphs over judgment. Okay, what is he saying here? He's essentially saying, we know he's writing Christians because at the very beginning of this passage that we started reading, he said, dear brothers and sisters. And then again in verse 5, he said, dear brothers and sisters. So we know that he's writing Christians. He's writing people who have received God's mercy. And he's essentially saying to them, because you've received his mercy, you should give mercy. You are going to be judged not by the law that you've disobeyed, God's command, all of us have disobeyed, but you were judged by the law that gives freedom. What does that mean? It means for those of us who are Christians, we are judged by what Christ has done for us on the cross. That on the cross, Jesus absorbed all of our sin and shame in his flesh. That he removed all of our trespasses, all of our shame, all of our sin. He took off of us and he gave us all of his mercy and his grace. We are now judged by the law that gives freedom. That Christ has set us free and removed all of our sin. Now, those who don't show mercy, they reveal that they have never received mercy. And someone who doesn't show mercy, who hasn't received mercy, they are actually going to be judged based on their sin, not based on the freedom that Christ gives. But you, O Christian, you have received his mercy. And so you're not judged by your deeds, you're judged by the work of Jesus on the cross. He was merciful to you, and therefore his mercy triumphs over judgment in you. You've received his mercy, so now you live merciful. To sum it up, James is essentially saying, here is how you're not going to show favoritism. Here's how you're not going to violate the law of God or the heart of God. Here's how you're going to live in a world and change the whole world, he says to these early Christians. Because those given mercy, give mercy. Christ has given you mercy. And when he changes your heart, you want to give mercy to other people. Christ was so merciful to us. We were poor. We could never earn our way to God. We could not climb our way to him, yet he bent down and scooped us up and brought us into a relationship with himself. And because Christ bent to serve you, you bend to serve others. Because Christ entered this world to rescue you, because he pursued you, you pursue others. Because Christ was merciful towards you and compassionate towards you, you show compassion and mercy towards others. Because Christ was kind to you, you be kind to others. Because Christ saw you in your need, you see others in their need and you have mercy upon others. Those who've been given mercy, they give mercy. Now, in this passage, giving mercy, in this passage, is about seeing image bearers of God in this passage who are wrestling with poverty, who are struggling with the weight of this world and having mercy and compassion on them and caring for them in their need. This is what this passage is about. These early Christians, they read this and they saw the widows and the orphans in their culture. They saw the vulnerable in their culture, and they served people the way that Christ served them, and they changed the entire world. And here we are, 2,000 years later, in the West at least, surrounded by a culture that is very different from what these early Christians were surrounded by, where we hear words like compassion and equality and caring for the poor, which was so opposite of what they were experiencing. The reason we have those words in our culture is because of these early Christians changing the world. And we're part of this long history, may we continue their legacy and have mercy on people the way Christ has had mercy on us. But there is some debate. What happens to a culture when people want the values of the kingdom without King Jesus? Friedrich Nietzsche actually had an opinion on that. And remember, Nietzsche's the atheist who hated compassion and equality and caring for the vulnerable and caring for the weak. He called Christianity a slave morality. He hated that we worshiped a God who we believe entered this world to serve us. What did Nietzsche, though, believe would happen to the West, to those of us here in the U.S., if we value equality and compassion, but we forget King Jesus? What would happen? Nietzsche believed, and he wanted this to happen, that if we want the kingdom without the king, that if we want values without holding tightly to Jesus being our king, that eventually the values will go away too. And he actually longed for that, Nietzsche did. He wanted the values of equality and compassion and kindness and caring for the vulnerable. He wanted those values gone. And he believed that if he could get more people to believe that God is dead, then those values would go away too. Which is why it is really important for us, as we seek the good of people in our cities, that we remind ourselves and people as we serve others that the reason we are seeking the good of others is because Jesus Christ sought our good. That the reason we are serving others is because we hold tightly to the belief that King Jesus took off his crown and his royal robe and stepped in our culture to serve us. So it's important that we not only live the values of the kingdom, but as we do, we remind ourselves the reason we live these values is because we believe in King Jesus, who sought our good, who made himself poor so that we could be everlasting rich. That though he was rich for your sake, he made himself poor to make you everlasting rich. We remind ourselves not only of the values of our kingdom, but of King Jesus, who loved us and pursued us and cared for us first. So we're in a season right now as a church where we are seeking the good of people in our cities. And I'm so proud of you, Mariners Church. Last week, we asked you to give to a special offering to transition our food pantries at different congregations we have, from what was called the box model, where we give people a box of food, to a choice model where we allow them to choose things to put into their box, and we're able to walk alongside them and pray with them and care for them as they do. Last week, I asked for $600,000, and boom, you gave well over that. And we are now in the process of transitioning from the box model to the choice model. I am so thankful for your generosity. I know some of you right now are like, man, I wanted to play with that. I wanted to be a part of that. I missed it. You can still give, and everything you give will go towards expanding our food pantry. But I'm so thankful to be a part of such a generous church. I also want to invite you to serve. And so Mariners Online, we have a great way for you to serve in our food pantry. And if you will scan the QR code on the screen or text outreach to the number on the screen, you will be taken to a website that will give you some instructions on how you can serve, how you can be a part of seeking the good of people in our cities and caring for the vulnerable. You have received mercy. And because you have received mercy, you express mercy to other people. I'm so proud of you, Mariners Church. Hey, I'm so glad that you joined us for our service today. And I hope and pray that God used this message to encourage you right where you are. I'd love if you hit the subscribe button because then you could get the next alert for whenever we have services and when we ever offer content here on YouTube. So subscribe and join us for Mariners Online.